let's move on to our program. I'm going to introduce our speaker. But first I want to tell you a little background. In 2022, the Door County Historical Society received a $25,000 grant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. This grant was to fund our First Peoples of Door County project. The goal of this project was to research and become educated in the traditions, culture, and stories of the First People of Door County, and add an accurate, truthful history of these communities into Door County's records. The research was then to be compiled into a publicly accessible exhibit at the Heritage Village and to engage visitors and share the stories and histories of the First Peoples of Door County. The Door County Historical Society was one of only 80 organizations that received a grant for this project. That deserves a round of applause, I think. That's nationwide, 80 organizations. The title of the grant was Telling the Full History, or Sharing Their Stories. The goal was to support the core activities of humanities-based organizations as the organizations recover from the pandemic and use historic places as catalysts for a more just and equitable society. So, once we received this grant, shortly after that I was hired. I didn't know what the heck to do with this grant, so to help us, we brought on the lovely Michaela Kraft to be our project consultant. Michaela, who grew up in Brussels, has a bachelor's degree in theater from UW Stevens Point. Go theater. Yep. And a master's degree in museum studies from the University of Washington, Seattle. So she was able to come on board and help us with this project. She's not new to the Door County Historical Society. While in high school and college, she often volunteered at both Eagle Bluff Lighthouse and Heritage Village. We have pictures of her as a young girl.
Historical dress.
Chopping cabbage, and she looks exactly the same today as she did then. It's not fair. But we're so fortunate that in addition to the leadership role on this project, that she has now joined our permanent staff, and she is our curator and interpretations coordinator. I have to write it down because I always forget what it is. And I don't really know what she does. You have to ask her because I don't know. So tonight, Michaela is going to share her extensive research on some of the First Peoples of Door County and how she used that knowledge and stories to create our newest permanent exhibit in Heritage Village, as well as a book that will be published. We plan to donate a copy of this book to the Door County Library and also sell copies of it in our general store at Heritage Village. And if you are interested in purchasing a book, I have a sign-up sheet in the check-in table that you can write your name and your phone number and email, and we'll let you know when it's available. So you can have a copy right hot off the press. So, all that said, please join me in welcoming Michaela Kraft.
Hello, everyone. I think I have seen almost all of you before, but it's nice to see you again. And to those I haven't, welcome. So I am the curator and interpretations coordinator, and that is a very broad job. I do a lot of things. Amy says, not really sure what, but it just means basically everything that Amy doesn't do. So I had the wonderful honor to research for this project. And as Amy said before, I was brought on in 2022 as a consultant. I have grown up in Door County, lived here my whole life. Of course, I've spent time other places, but I've always come back because I think it's a really special place. And I think it has a really special history. I think that there's opportunity, though, for a deeper history that maybe wasn't examined before. And that's why I think it's so wonderful that this grant was awarded to the Historical Society, so we could shine light on that. So, thank you again for coming. I did about a year and a half of research for this. And next slide, please, Elizabeth. It culminated in our newest permanent exhibit, which is at the Heritage Village. And it basically focuses on 4 tribes in the Door County area who had a significant impact on the peninsula. So I do want to preface this by saying there are many more tribes and many more indigenous groups that have connections to the area and that have ancestral lands here. And this is not exhaustive in any way, shape, or form. It is just breaking the tip of the iceberg, as you'd say. But the 4 that I chose to cover were the 4 that, through meeting with elders and research, I thought were the most connected to the peninsula. So I wanted to focus in a little bit on my research tonight and share with you some of my favorite stuff that I learned. If you would like a broader overview of everything, once again, I encourage you to order the book or go to the websites of these tribes, visit the tribes. They are the ones who really have the story to tell. So I definitely would urge you to contact them as well. But I wanted to focus on oral histories and origin stories because that's something that I wasn't able to really, I think, convey on the exhibit. And in the book, it's written, and we are very Euro-American here still in Door County, and we're not used to storytelling as a form of history keeping always. And I think that it's something that is very important to the tribes, and it was something that came up again and again and again, and I wanted to honor it in a way that could be shared orally. Okay, so next slide. So archaeology and oral histories go hand in hand. So we are going to talk a little bit about the archaeological history of the peninsula. There is tons and tons of evidence for indigenous habitation of the peninsula as far back as 12,000 years. So a lot of the groups that they believed were here thousands of years ago were nomadic, and they moved seasonally according to the availability of resources. So remains from this time included arrowheads and other tools used for hunting and foraging. Since they were nomadic, they relied heavily on the seasons and on what was available from Lake Michigan. I know we still rely on Lake Michigan today. And then permanent settlement actually can be traced back about 2,000 years. And they have decided to break up these periods of settlement, the archaeologists, into like epochs. So there's the early Midland, Woodland, or North Bay culture era. I know, there's a lot going on there. And that is 2,000 years ago when permanent settlement started. And that's characterized by a transition from the nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle to a society that was more sedentary and incorporated plant cultivation and pottery construction. And this is when we really start to see communities, and we have a few sites in Door County that are indicative of this time period, some that are in Sturgeon Bay. A lot of the sites have been kept secret and will continue to be kept secret for the respect of the tribes, but there is ample archaeological remains for this. So then the late woodland period, which is the next span of time if we're moving chronologically, this took place from 400 to 1000 AD, and it saw the continued advancement in pottery and stone arrowheads and other tools. So when you think of indigenous habitation, I think a lot of people associate pottery and, teepees and things like that with the Plains Indians and that whole separate culture. And we have that indigenous culture here. It looks a little different, and it's a little more specialized to what they had at hand. So a lot of the remains of their dwellings, of their pottery, of their tools have been lost because of the preservation of the environment. So out in the plains and out in the desert, that's a really arid environment, and it tends to keep things nice and fresh for years and years and years. But here, it's been raining, for example, for weeks. So that preservation doesn't tend to happen as well. But it is there, and we still have some of this evidence. So this late woodland period that had the pottery and the stone arrowheads and the other tools, that's also when trade and travel started to really play a major factor in indigenous lifestyle as well. And that brought us all the way to the current archaeological era, which we are living in now, which is called the Oneida cultural epoch. And that began about 400 years ago. This aligns with the beginning of recorded history of white settlers. It's ongoing, it's continuously changing. But some people believe that we should be in a separate period now, even, that we should be in the post-contact period. We should change the wording a little bit. That references, again, the first encounters between Europeans and indigenous people. And since we're talking about encounters, I would obviously need to discuss that the arrival of Europeans began a really long and difficult struggle for the tribes in the area, in all of North America, all over the world, and it was a struggle for them to control their traditions and to hold on to their ancestral lifeways and lands. And this struggle really plays a part in oral history as well. The modern and the white recording of history is mirrored in these oral histories. But despite these injustices, Wisconsin's indigenous tribes remain resilient, and they work to preserve and celebrate their cultural identities. So I would like to share with you a couple stories that I have found from the different tribes, from elders or from archives, from publications. I do want to preface it again by saying I am not trying to make these my own stories, and that I got permission from tribal members to tell the stories. So we'll talk about the Menominee. They are one of the major groups. So many tribal historians and archaeologists actually think that the Menominee were the first group here. And I think that when you look at indigenous oral history, almost all of the tribes will say that they were the first in any place. But this has been matched up with the archaeological evidence, with how they've created stone tools and their specific mode of constructing their dwellings has lined up with the Menominee, that a lot of archaeologists think that they are the oldest formed social group here. So most current Wisconsin tribes have migrated to the state from their historic place of origin, but the Menominee has remained on their ancestral land since at least the end of the last ice age. So that's where I was talking about 12,000 years. They've been here a long time. The Wisconsin First Nations website identifies the entirety of Door County and many other areas of northeast Wisconsin as an ancestral Menominee land. And it's unique among current Wisconsin tribes because Menominee oral history asserts that they have always lived in Wisconsin specifically. So a lot of other tribes have a general area a spiritual area where they hail from, but the Menominee oral history asserts specifically that it is Wisconsin, which is really interesting. The tribe's creation story begins at the mouth of the Menominee River, which is only 60 miles from their present reservation. It's from this river that the Menominee believe their 5 clans, which are the ancestral bear, eagle, wolf, moose, and crane, originate. And since most tribes have been relocated hundreds or thousands of miles across the country, it's really rare that the Menominee have been able to retain portions of their original homeland. So I think this is really important. And so a creation story is more general, and we don't have, specific characters and then this happened, because it depends on the family, and it depends on the kin group, and it depends on who's telling the story and why. We do have some other stories about things that are very important to the Menominee, origin stories from Wisconsin as well. So one of them is tobacco, which is very popular for different reasons today, but tobacco actually has a really long history of having a deep spiritual connection for Indigenous people. And this story is just a snippet. Like I said, I encourage you to explore more. It's called Grasshopper and the Origin of Tobacco. One day, Manabush was walking past a high mountain when he smelled a delightful fragrance. The mountain was home to a giant who was known to be the keeper of tobacco. Manabush found a cavern in the side of the mountain and went inside, following a passage which led into the center of the mountain where the giant lived. And the giant asked for some tobacco. The giant told him to come back in a year. Manabush looked around the giant's cavern and saw bags and bags of tobacco. So he snatched one, dashed up the mountain, closely pursued by the giant. When Manabush reached the edge of a cliff, he fell down flat, and the giant leapt over him and fell over the cliff and into the chasm. Manabush grabbed the giant by the back and threw him to the ground, and they said, "For your stinginess, you will become the grasshopper, and everyone will know you by your stained mouth. You will become a pest and bother all those who raise tobacco." Then Manabush took the tobacco home and divided it among the people and gave them seed so they could grow it themselves and use it for offerings and blessing. So that is from an oral history that was recorded in 1890. So it's really interesting just how they can hold on to that and take something that is very much, observable and what we would think of as, we'll just explain this scientifically, and they preserve that knowledge in a really beautiful, performative way. So that is one example. Another really wonderful connection that the Menominee have with Wisconsin specifically is their connection to wild rice. And this is something that is really important to the Ojibwe as well, and the Ho-Chunk. So this is by no means the only tribe that relies on wild rice. But according to Menominee tradition, the wild rice, since it springs up from under the earth and the water, it's the gift of one of the underneath beings, probably Sectox male. Forgive me if I mispronounce that. And they believe that the birds on their migration follow these beings and bring rice to them. They sometimes, though seldom, introduce the plant to new waters. So it's, again, following that tradition and following that origin of it comes from the land. The Ho-Chunk are our next visit, and they also have a really special connection to Wisconsin. The Ho-Chunk actually don't have a reservation here in Wisconsin. They were kicked off multiple times. They were removed to places like Nebraska and South Dakota, and they were not recognized by the Wisconsin government. So what they did, since they have such a fantastic connection to Wisconsin and to its land and its resources, they used the Homestead Act, which, if you guys will remember, is for what many people think of as, farming and manifest destiny and things like that, but they actually used it to buy up tracts of land and turn that into their own reservation. So they have amassed thousands of acres this way, and they have been quoted as saying that they will always find their way back to Wisconsin. So the Ho-Chunk really do have a special connection here. There's evidence that they had a large permanent settlement near Green Bay before the Euro-American settlers came. So this village, archaeologists thought that it served as a centralized meeting place for tribes who were known to forage and hunt seasonally on land from the Door Peninsula to the Mississippi River. Material remains show that it was densely populated, which is interesting, and it ties them to other tribes that are in other areas of the country, like the Sioux, because earlier the Menominee started very nomadic, and something with the Ho-Chunk is they tend to be very densely populated and agriculturally focused, which is not in keeping with the other tribes. So the Green Bay settlement contained remnants of large gardens as well as domestic dwellings and is believed to have been inhabited for some time. The exact size of their village and larger territory was not recorded prior to European contact, but was likely over 8.5 million acres from archaeological remains. And though the Ho-Chunk ancestrally are Siouan, once in Wisconsin, they were surrounded by Algonquin tribal groups like the Menominee and the Ojibwe, and these groups, the Menominee and the Ojibwe, have been their closest historical allies here in the state. They differed from the Algonquin tribes in language, culture, spirituality, and their social organization. Like I said, the Ho-Chunk were more agricultural based as opposed to the Menominee, who relied more on the seasons and a nomadic lifestyle. But they began intermarrying and sharing traditions and material culture. So there is a record of that blending of traditions that you can still see today. So many Ho-Chunk oral histories place the tribe's origin at Red Banks, which they have in their language is called Mogashooch. Again, forgive me for the pronunciation. And this is on the shores of Green Bay. So there's some debate about whether it truly is Green Bay or if it's over on the other side of the lake, but a lot of scholars believe that it is Green Bay. So according to the elders, the Ho-Chunk have always lived in the states of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois. Members of the tribe assert that their history in the area dates back past multiple ice ages. So something else that's really interesting and that I came across a lot in my research is this concept of time immemorial. And I think this has become really popular with other indigenous groups not popular as a new thing, but in sharing with other cultures that this land has always been here and they have always been here. So we like to put a date on it, and they are saying there really is no date. It's forever. So though all Wisconsin tribes were negatively impacted by European disease after contact, Ho-Chunk oral tradition places particular emphasis on the toll these epidemics took on their communities. Obviously, that's a whole nother lecture, European contact and epidemics. But this was likely due to the fact that the Ho-Chunk tended to settle in larger groups. Like I said before, so they were more densely populated. So a lot of their oral histories will focus on the fact that they've had to rebuild and they've had to protect against infection and insurgents from outside sources. The tribe's oral histories also work to solve historical mysteries, like who constructed Wisconsin's massive effigy mounds, which is another great topic. Multiple Ho-Chunk stories credit tribal ancestors with the creation of the mounds that were constructed throughout the Midwest during the late woodland period. It's also important to note that the Ho-Chunk incorporate the future into each of their stories. So this is another thing that at first could be a little hard to wrap your mind around. There's this idea of you're telling a story for your generation, you're telling a story of the generation before you, and you're telling the story for the generation that will come after you. So it's about continuous time, which I think is really beautiful. So they do incorporate the future into that, and they put constant consideration on that part of the story. The tribal members are confident that they will always be here, calling the lands of Wisconsin home. And you can find many places where the Ho-Chunk have made their mark. They are very involved down in the Wisconsin Dells area. And this is something I talk about a little bit in the exhibit and in the book. But they were very adept at breaking into the tourism industry. So that's another connection with Door County. So a lot of Ho-Chunk families would perform or become artisans, something for that, and in the tourism community down in the central part of the state. So there's still a lot of that to be found there and here. So the Potawatomi, I'm sure many of you will recognize them. We have a state park named after the Potawatomi, and they have one of their ancestors buried in Peninsula State Park on the golf course. The Potawatomi, though, are actually a newcomer in terms of deep time here on the peninsula. There are various sites, archaeological sites on Rock Island, Washington Island, and throughout the peninsula that go back over 500 years. So they're not that new, of course. But in terms of the last ice age, they were over towards the New York area. That was their ancestral point of origin before warring between other indigenous groups sent them west. Both archaeologists and tribal historians believe the Potawatomi originated near the Straits of the St. Lawrence River and moved to the Great Lake region within the last 1,000 years. And they have lived here on the peninsula, like I said, for over 400 years and still hold lots of traditional ties to the area. The tribe's settlement structure was largely dependent on the seasons and availability of natural resources. So they are more, they're more like the Menominee. They were more nomadic and hunter-gatherers. And in the summers, though, large villages would be set up along the edge of forests. So they could concentrate all of their work and their time to make the most of the resources they had available. These sites were often near prairies, streams, and other water sources. Such a diversity of landscape allowed the Potawatomi to gather a variety of resources that the winter would require them to use and to ration. So this made larger, more concentrated populations difficult, obviously, in the winter. So they would often break off into smaller bands in the winter, and they would distribute the resources then. So both settlement patterns saw Potawatomi living in dome-shaped wigwams of bent saplings covered with woven mats or sheets of bark. So again, we go back to how does that preserve? It doesn't preserve in the way we might think it does, because it's organic material. And since they were organized into clans, this social structure was likely how the summer villages functioned as well. So they were patrilineal, father's line, but did retain links to the families of their mother's father, providing a larger network of kin to work with and rely on. And this dictated how they told stories as well. So a lot of times character names would be dependent on whose side of the family you were telling it from. The Potawatomi were further divided into two opposing groups based on their order of birth within the family, and this division had nothing to do with the clan structure, actually, but it served to create a fierce sense of competition between the senior and the junior side of the tribe. So that would manifest itself in a lot of different ways, storytelling included. They would have lots of competition, and something that I found about the Potawatomi, the contemporary Potawatomi, is that they have this fantastic spirit for competitive games even now. So they will host they hosted the Indigenous Olympics, and they bring in tribes from all over, and they travel. So that atmosphere of sharing and competing has really stayed with them. The Potawatomi refer to themselves as Neshnabek, or the first people. This reflects the tribal knowledge that they have always been stewards of their land and always will be. Their oral tradition asserts that in the beginning, the Neshnabek settled along the shores of the Great Salt Water, which people think is the Atlantic Ocean, near the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. Eventually, stories shared the migration of the Potawatomi toward the Great Lakes region, where they remain today. And then one popular history of their connection to the land is from Indian Nations of Wisconsin, Histories of Endurance and Renewal by Patty Lowe, which is the most fabulous book if you're ever interested in this. I did a lot of my research from it, and it was completely wonderful. And it is Potawatomi and the plants that nourish them. 5 mysterious strangers visited a young woman who was spared after the Creator lifted up a whole world and dropped it in a lake. The first visitor was tall and wore a green blanket, which turned into tobacco leaves. The second, who was short and round, rolled on the ground and became a pumpkin. The third and fourth visitors became beans and squash. The fifth was a handsome man whom the young woman married. After their wedding, the husband revealed himself to be the leader of the Corn Nation. Rain blessed their union and produced an abundance of living things. The woman and the corn chief gave thanks to the good spirit and taught their children how to pray and offer their thanks for the corn, pumpkins, beans, squash, and tobacco. All right, so the final group that I've really focused on are the Ojibwe. They are the largest indigenous group north of Mexico. So there is lots of variety, and again, so much that you could spend your whole life studying it. But we do have 5 clans here in Wisconsin, in northern Wisconsin. And prior to European contact, there's archaeological and anthropological evidence that Ojibwe did inhabit the Dore Peninsula. There's actually evidence that they were here as late as the 1800s, which is pretty recently. And in fact, there is a map, I couldn't get my hands on it, but there is a map that shows there's an Ojibwe village on the peninsula as recently as 1820. The Ojibwe have lived in wigwams, like the Potawatomi, and they were built by joining poles together and then covering them with woven mats and birch bark. Their settlement pattern also depended on the seasons, once again, since the tribe was dependent on the availability of natural resources. They also had this a larger summer population working together, splitting off into bands in the winter. And something really wonderful about the Ojibwe is that they have a whole season for storytelling. So in the winters, they will place a particular emphasis on teaching their children morals and history in those long nights when they can't be doing something outside or they can't be doing something fun necessarily. And this is something they continue today. The Wisconsin Historical Society puts out a wonderful series in the winter in January, which focuses on Ojibwe oral histories, and they are free to attend their webinars. I highly, highly recommend them. They are wonderful. It really showcases how instrumental oral histories have been to them, for their culture. In subsequent centuries, small numbers of Ojibwe families have continued to start these traditions as well in places like museums and exhibits. So there are many places up north where you can go and you can see tribal presented museum exhibits that are about this oral tradition. And it's on the tribe's websites. So creation myths for the Ojibwe can be both cultural and geologic. So I have another one to share with you called Winnebuzu and the Great Flood. It may seem familiar. It seems that every culture has a flood story. And this is also from Indian Nations of Wisconsin by Patty Lowe. The Creator purified Mother Earth with water. Then Winnebuzu, half spirit, half man, found himself, along with the animals, clinging to a log. Winnebuzu and the animals took turns diving under the water and bringing up some earth. After better divers failed, Muskrat gave his life in a successful effort to retrieve a few grains of sand. From that bit of matter, Winnebuzu created a new world, which Turtle offered to carry on his back. In honor of Turtle's sacrifice, some native people today refer to North America as Turtle Island. So animals are also a common feature in the Ojibwe oral histories and in all other tribal oral histories as well. The tribe's appreciation for them is clear in stories like Fisher Goes to the Sky World, which I won't read all of, but it relates how 4 animals stole the sun and brought the seasons to Earth. And tales like this affirm the Ojibwe view of animals as being helpers and being endowed with their own spirits and purposes and not as creatures to be used exclusively to fill human needs. So I do have one little last excerpt from Fisher Goes to the Sky World, and I would like to leave you with that before I do questions. So it says, Mother Earth was dark and cold because the sky people had captured the sun in all its warmth. Fisher, aided by his friends Otter, Lynx, and Wolverine, dug a hole in the sky world and tried to capture the sun. As the sun's rays escaped, the earth began to transform itself. The snow melted and plants and trees appeared. By the time the sky people discovered Fisher, he and his friends had dug a hole large enough for the sun to warm the earth half the year. So I definitely encourage everyone to continue to do their own research. Like I said, all these tribes have cultural centers that are open to the public, that have exhibits and videos. And if you just want to meet with someone, they are warm and open to that as well. I hope you enjoyed hearing some alternate explanations, and I hope you do some further research yourself. So I'll take questions. Yeah.
All of your studies, what appreciation has deepened of the First Peoples culture for you?
I think because I was a theater major, so I think that appreciation of the story as a living thing and the story as the artifact, because in my job as the curator, I have the wonderful opportunity of working with lots of physical objects, you know, coffee grinders and jars and things that are really fascinating, but stories, you can't see stories, but they're just as important, and they teach you just as much about how people used to live and how you're going to live. And I don't think that is, I don't think that's really broken into our culture as much as it could have. So that's something that I found really beautiful learning about. Any other question? Yes.
Yeah, I'll take the second one then. As you were saying, there's some things of our culture. Many of us may be feeling as we age, our stories, nobody's interested in them. I know, we're all historical, but it doesn't be as important as it once was. And yet, you find that in American First Peoples, the elderly are revered.
Yes, and I think there is that, when you research the social structure as well, a lot of times, even when they break up into the smaller groups, it still includes that multi-generational family. So the clan structure will still be great-grandparents, grandparents, children, grandchildren. And that, you're right, that's something we don't really, it's sneaking in there with the pricing of, housing and stuff, but but not culturally, I don't think. Do you have a question too?
Did you work with Tom Davis at all?
Yes, I did. I did work with Tom Davis.
I'm just starting this book about names on Washington.
Yes, he's amazing. Tom Davis was the poet laureate of Door County, and he has many fabulous books that we have for sale in Heritage Village. Yes. Yes?
So, Michaela, can you tell us more about the book that you wrote?
Yeah, so the book is basically one big research compilation that I tried to make as easily understood as possible. So I've said this before, but when I was, growing up here, we didn't get a ton of Indigenous instruction. We maybe got a few days, and I know, we're not gonna get into curriculum and everything, but there's nothing really out there for people who are just plain interested and don't want to write a thesis on it. So the book is 4 or 5 chapters, and it basically goes through the archaeological history, like I shared with you, oral history, and then more about, post-contact, what happened with Euro-American settlers, and then what a lot of these tribes' governments and social programs and things like that look like today, and how you can learn more and how you can get involved in language preservation and things like that. Because that's something I came across too, was that there's a lot of need for the preservation of their native languages being spoken. And there's been a lot of websites and tribal schools specifically formed to continue that. So the book is more of a reference. Here's how you can learn it quickly and find more information. Yes?
And how much is
That's a great question. $10. Yes?
Were the European American explorers, or hundreds of years ago, interested at all in the indigenous people's stories?
So it's very complicated. There's lots of different European groups that came here. So the relationship that the Menominee had with the French is very different than the relationship the Menominee had with the English. It all depends on, that age-old thing of money and marriage and who can do what for who. So I know that there have been stories that the French were kind to the native people here, but by and large, it does not seem like they were very interested. And yeah, it depends on who you ask, of course. And our version of history is recorded by us. So of course we are going to act like we are interested in their stories, and we don't have access to their oral histories at the time or what they were going through at that time. So yes.
I grew up in Fox River Valley, Wenatchee specifically, and we had indigenous families living in the neighborhood, going to school. they were Winnebagos. And then later, they were called Ho-Chunks. Can you tell me about that?
Yes, I'm glad you asked something that I can actually speak on. Because there's a lot I can't speak on, but that I can. So, yes, the Winnebago, now the Ho-Chunk, they've changed their name. So originally, when the French and the English came through, they misunderstood their language. And they were known as, to them, the people of the stinking water. And it's basically a bastardization of that. So that's why they said Winnebago, because they couldn't pronounce it. But Ho-Chunk is what this group has always been called and what they've always called themselves. And it means people of the sacred voice. So they actually had a special election amendment done in the 90s, I believe, where they changed that formally. So Winnebago is technically something that has been used to refer to them, but it's offensive. Yeah. Yes.
So did you find out anything about the real naming of this store?
Yeah, so in the Menominee section, we're pretty close to it right now, actually. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Chief Oshkosh, and I've done some research with the Egg Harbor Historical Society, too, for him. The Menominee have had a lot of place names of their own, and it seems that they have always associated that passage with danger. Death's Door or Porte de Mort is more of a French term, but they had named it as a place, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but as somewhere you only go during very special parts of the year when it's safe. So that lore goes back very far. Yes.
Michaela, could you tell us about the exhibits, signs that you have at Heritage Village?
Yeah, so at Heritage Village, there are 10 signs. They are right behind the school, and each tribe has 2 signs. So there's lots of text on them. I apologize for that. But it's hard to condense the whole people into 2 signs anyway. But there are spots on all of those signs that give just a little snippet of the archaeological history, current initiatives, things like that. And then there are 2 separate signs as well that give resources and places to go to learn more. And things about looking to the future. Any more? No? Oh, yes.
So based on when you were describing the settlements, the historic settlements and homelands of the tribes were, at Red Banks, the first natives to lay eyes on Europeans would have been Menominee, maybe?
So it seems that the Menominee archaeologically were the first, but the stories that come from the traders and from the Ho-Chunk are that it was actually the Ho-Chunk that was living in that area at the time. And it sounds like the Menominee were more to the northwest at that time.
Okay.
So
memorize.
yeah,
You said lived where?
yeah, so their origin stories come from where their reservation is now, and that is by Kashina. So not quite Green Bay. So they wouldn't have necessarily been in the area at that time. They would have been in the state, but it probably would have been Ho-Chunk. Yeah. Oh, one more. One more.
I wonder if any of the tribes have any stories about the Great Fire, the festival fire, that's in the 1870s.
I'm sure they do. I'm, I haven't heard them, but I'm sure they do because with that Ojibwe storytelling series, oral history is a continuously evolving art form. So they're always adding to it and amending it and changing it. So I'm sure that it has made its way in there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michaela, for giving us that little peek inside the door to this huge and fascinating topic that we have so much to learn about.
Yep.
Every time I hear you talk, I learn something new. So it's never ending. But thank you very much.